My family read me out of the will in front of the entire room. Claire gets nothing, the lawyer said, was that I was the one who actually controlled every dollar in that room.
For 31 years, I was the daughter nobody quite remembered to include. Not cruelly, just consistently.
My grandfather did something none of them saw coming. Quietly, in this very room.
They thought the reading of the will was the end of the story. It wasn't. Because the real document, the one that actually mattered, Boo, hadn't been read yet.
They left me with nothing. What they didn't know was that nothing was never going to be my ending, Ted. Because I was the one holding the final say all along.
My family read me out of my grandfather's will, in a room full of relatives who barely looked at me while they did it. What none of them knew, what only my grandfather and I knew, was that the will they're just finished reading wasn't actually the document that mattered. If you've ever been the one left out of the room, where decisions get made about your own life, I think this story is going to matter to you. And if it does, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit like and subscribe before we start, because there's a lot more where this came from. Let's begin. My name is Claire Bennett, and I'm 31 years old. I grew up the youngest of 3 children in a family that had built a modest but comfortable fortune over 2 generations. The Bennett Family Trust, anchored by a chain of hardware stores, my grandfather Harold Bennett had founded in the 1970s and expanded across 3 states before selling the operating business 15 years ago and converting the proceeds into a trust that quietly supported the whole extended family. My older siblings, Daniel and Rachel, were the visible children. Daniel, the ambitious one who'd gone into commercial real estate, Rachel, the charming one who'd married well and thrown herself into a life of country club, luncheons and volunteer board seats. I was the quiet middle distance between them, an accountant who worked steadily and unremarkably at a regional firm, the kind of person who got introduced at family gatherings with a slight pause, as though our relatives were double-checking my name before saying it. I want to be clear that my family wasn't cruel to me. Not in any dramatic storybook way. There was no single, memorable act of cruelty I could point to and say, that's where it started. It was smaller and more corrosive than that. A lifetime of being the one whose birthday got remembered a day late, whose achievements got a polite nod before the conversation returned to Daniel's latest deal or Rachel's latest gala. My mother Patricia favored Rachel openly, the way some mothers favor the daughter who reflects the version of femininity they didn't always wanted for themselves. My father, Thomas, favored Daniel just as openly, seeing in him the ambitious businessman he'd always hoped to raise. I existed in the space between their favoritisms, tolerated rather than celebrated, present at every holiday but rarely truly seen at any of them. My grandfather Harold was different. He was 86 years old, sharp-minded well past the age most people expect sharpness to fade, and he had a particular way of watching our family dynamics that I only fully understood, in hindsight, as the careful observation of a man quietly gathering evidence. He'd call me on Sunday afternoons, not to make conversation exactly, but to ask real questions about my work, about how I actually spent my time, about what I thought was fair and unfair in the world. I didn't realize, for years, that these calls were interviews. I thought they were simply what a grandfather did with a granddaughter he happened to like. Harold passed away in early spring, quietly, in his sleep, the way most people hope to go. The funeral was large. The Bennett name still carried weight in our community, and half the town turned out to pay respects. I stood at the graveside between my parents, watching Daniel accept condolences with the smooth competence of someone accustomed to managing a room, watching Rachel dab at her eyes with a handkerchief that matched her coat, and feeling, as I so often did at family events, like a spectator at my own life. 2 weeks after the funeral, our family gathered at the offices of Whitmore and Associates, the law firm that had handled Bennett family affairs for 3 generations, for the formal reading of Harold's will. The conference room was wood-paneled, heavy with the particular gravity of old money and older furniture, and our family attorney, a measured, silver-haired man named Gerald Whitmore, read through the document with the careful, unhurried cadence of someone who had done this exact task many times before. The will itself was, on its surface, straightforward and unremarkable in its favoritism. The house, Harold's grand old estate home with its wraparound porch, went to Daniel. A substantial cash bequest, along with Harold's extensive antique furniture collection, went to Rachel. My parents received a modest sum in recognition of a lifetime of family devotion, language that struck me, even in the moment, as oddly formal for two people who'd raised 3 children with such uneven attention. And then, Gerald reached the final paragraph and read, in the same measured voice he'd used for everything else, that Claire Bennett was to receive no direct bequest from the estate, her needs and interests having been otherwise provided for. I felt the room's attention shift toward me, not with sympathy exactly, but with the mild, uncomfortable curiosity of people watching an old family pattern confirm itself in writing. My mother's mouth tightened into something that might have been discomfort, or might simply have been her resting expression around uncomfortable topics. Daniel offered a brief, awkward, "That's rough, Claire," the kind of sentence people say when they don't actually want to sit with the weight of what they'd ferment. Acknowledging. Rachel didn't say anything at all. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, and did what I had trained myself to do at every family gathering for 3 decades. I absorbed the moment quietly and gave nothing away. What none of them knew, what I had known for exactly 4 months, since a private meeting Harold had arranged with me alone, without a single other family member present, was that the will they had just heard read aloud was not, in fact, the operative document governing the majority of the Bennett family's actual wealth. 4 months before his death, Harold had called me and asked me to meet him at Whitmore & Associates on a Tuesday afternoon, telling my parents only that he needed help with some paperwork, a phrase vague enough that nobody thought to question it. In that meeting, with Gerald Whitmore present as legal counsel, Harold explained something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. The bulk of the Bennett family's actual wealth wasn't distributed through his personal will at all. It lived inside the Bennett Family Trust, the entity that had held the proceeds from the sale of the hardware store chain 15 years earlier, and which continued to fund substantial portions of Daniel's business ventures, Rachel's lifestyle, and my parents' retirement, through discretionary distributions that had, for 15 years, been approved by Harold himself as sole trustee. Harold told me, in that quiet law office, that he intended to name me as the sole successor, trustee of the Bennett Family Trust upon his death. Not Daniel, not Rachel, not my parents, but me. The trust document gave the trustee full discretionary authority over all future distributions, how much, to whom, under what conditions, and whether at all. "I've watched this family for 30 years, he told me, his voice steady despite his age. "I've watched Daniel spend money he hasn't earned as though it were owed to him. I've watched Rachel measure her worth by things this trust bought her. And I've watched you, Claire, quietly build a life on your own, asking this family for nothing, expecting nothing, while somehow still being treated as though you deserved the least of anyone in this room. I'm not doing this to reward you with money. I'm doing it because you're the only one of my grandchildren I trust not to let this family's worst instincts run unchecked forever." I asked him, sitting in that office 4 months before his death, why he'd cut me out of the will so completely, so publicly, if he trusted me with so much more behind the scenes. He looked at me for a long moment and said something I've turned over in my mind many times since. "Because the moment this family finds out you hold the trust, Claire, they're going to treat you differently than they ever have before, and I needed to know, before I died, that you'd actually earned their trust the hard way, on your own, not because of what you controlled. The will reading is going to hurt. I'm sorry for that. But I need you to sit in that room and let them underestimate you one more time, because it's going to matter enormously, later, that you handled that moment with grace instead of announcing your power the second you had it." So I sat in that conference room 2 weeks after his funeral, and I let my family believe, one final time, that I had been left with nothing. I let Daniel's awkward, dismissive condolence land without correction. I let Rachel's silence sit unchallenged. I drove home that evening to my modest apartment, made myself a cup of tea, and sat with the strange, heavy privacy of knowing something that would fundamentally reshape my family's understanding of itself, and choosing, for one more day, not to say it. The unraveling began 3 weeks later, when Daniel called Gerald Whitmore's office to arrange what he assumed would be a routine trust distribution to finalize funding for a new, commercial property he was under contract to purchase. A distribution he had, apparently, discussed informally with Harold before his death, and assumed would proceed automatically, the way trust distributions always had under Harold's decades of quiet, generous management. Gerald informed him, with the same measured neutrality he brought to everything, that all trust distribution requests would now need to be submitted to and approved by the trust new sole trustee. "Who's the new trustee?" Daniel asked, according to what Gerald told me later, clearly expecting the answer to be a bank, or a committee, or perhaps Gerald's own firm. "Your sister," Gerald said. "Claire." I found out later that Daniel called Rachel immediately after that call, and Rachel called our mother, and within about 4 hours, my phone had 11 missed calls and a string of increasingly incredulous text messages, the tone shifting from confusion to disbelief to, in Rachel's case, something close to panic. I let the calls sit for a while, not out of spite, but because I genuinely needed the time to decide how I wanted to walk into this conversation, not as someone finally getting to wield power over people who'd overlooked me for 31 years, but as someone trying to actually honor what my grandfather had asked of me, to hold this family's worst instincts in check with grace, not with vengeance. I called a family meeting myself, at Whitmore & Associates, in the same conference room where the will had been read. My parents came. Daniel came, visibly agitated, arriving 5 minutes late, and immediately asking, before he'd even sat down, whether this whole trustee thing was some kind of legal mistake that needed correcting. Rachel came pale and quiet, twisting her wedding ring the way she did when she was anxious. Gerald sat at the head of the table with a folder in front of him, and when everyone had settled, uncomfortable and expectant, into their seats, he nodded toward me to begin. I told them everything, calmly and without embellishment. I explained the trust structure, Harold's decision 4 months before his death, his reasoning as he'd explained it to me, and the discretionary authority I now held over every future distribution the Bennett family trust would ever make. I watched my father's face move through something between shock and a strange, dawning recalculation of 31 years of overlooked attention. I watched my mother's hand come up to cover her mouth. I watched Daniel's jaw tighten as the full weight of what sole trustee actually meant for his commercial property deal settled over him. Why would he do that? Daniel asked, and I could hear, underneath the disbelief, something rawer, something closer to hurt, the specific hurt of a golden child discovering, for the first time, that the family's real center of gravity had quietly shifted away from him without his notice. "Because he trusted me," I said, and I let that sentence sit in the room without softening it, the way I had learned, slowly, over the previous 3 weeks, that it needed to sit. "Not because I'm smarter than either of you, or because I deserve this more than you do. Because he watched this family for 30 years, and he decided the person who never asked this family for anything was the person least likely to burn it down." The weeks that followed were not simple, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this can sometimes make reconciliation sound easier and faster than it actually is. Daniel and I had several difficult, uncomfortable conversations about the commercial property deal, and I ultimately approved a modified version of the distribution, smaller than here, originally wanted, tied to conditions Harold himself had specified in the trust language for large business distributions, conditions Daniel had apparently never bothered to read closely in 15 years of assuming money would simply appear when he needed it. He was angry about it, for a while. Rachel was frightened initially that I might use the trust to punish her for years of casual exclusion, and it took real, deliberate effort on my part to show her, through my actual decisions rather than my words, that I had no interest in becoming a smaller, meaner version of the favoritism I'd grown up inside. My parents, in some ways, had the hardest adjustment. My mother called me one evening, several weeks after that meeting, and said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this whole story. I think I spent 30 years not really looking at you, Claire, because you never made yourself hard to overlook. And I think some part of me is only sitting up and paying attention now, because your grandfather forced my hand. I'm ashamed of that. I don't know how to undo 30 years, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me. I told her I would. I meant it, but I also told her, gently, that trying would mean actually asking me real questions the way Harold used to. Not simply treating me differently because I now controlled the family's money. And to her credit, in the months since, she largely has. I want to say clearly that this story isn't really about money, even though money is the mechanism that finally forced my family to look at me differently. It's about the strange, specific pain of being consistently underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. And the quieter, harder work of deciding, once you finally have power you never asked for, what kind of person you want to be with it. I could have used the trust to punish Daniel and Rachel for 31 years of casual exclusion. Some days, in the rawest moments, I wanted to. But my grandfather didn't hand me this responsibility so I could even a scoreboard. He handed it to me because he believed, correctly, that I was capable of holding real power, without needing to wield it cruelly to finally feel seen. A year later, our family gatherings look different than they used to. Not perfect, old patterns don't dissolve completely, and there are still moments where I catch my mother's attention drifting toward Rachel's. It's the latest story before it settles fully on mine. But there's something different underneath it now. A baseline of attention that wasn't there before, earned not through the money itself but through the months of hard, honest conversations the money forced my family to finally have with me. Daniel and I talk regularly now about his business plans, and I've come to genuinely respect the ambition underneath his old carelessness. Rachel and I have grown closer than we've ever been, in a friendship that finally feels mutual instead of performed. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Being overlooked by the people who are supposed to know you best doesn't mean you're actually as small as they've made you feel. Sometimes the people who see you most clearly are watching quietly from the margins, gathering their own evidence, waiting for the right moment to hand you back the power your Hopi family never thought to give you themselves. I was left with nothing, on paper, in a room full of people who'd spent 31 years underestimating me. What none of them understood, in that moment, was that nothing was never actually the end of my murder, because the final say had been mine all along. Wherever you are, whatever room you've sat quietly through while people decided things about your worth without really looking at you, I hope you find your own version of the final say, the moment someone finally hands you back the power to write your own ending. And if this story meant something to you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told. And I'd love for you to be here for the next one.